What's really coming next, we believe, is the post-channel era. And that spans from 2026, in other words, now, to, we're going to say, 2035.
Tony, all this talk about eras makes me feel like we should give a shout out to Taylor Swift and on her nuptials, and I'm sure she's listening.
Welcome to Real Story on MarTech. Ruthless advocates for your MarTech mission. Advising buyers with just the facts on stacks to get you on the right track.
All right, welcome back to the Real Story on MarTech. My name's Jarrod Gingras. I'm the managing director of Real Story Group.
And I'm Tony Byrne, founder of Real Story Group.
All right, Tony, today's topic is getting to MarTech 4.0.
Yeah, and this is the second time in as many months that we've talked about quote unquote 4.0.
On previous episodes of this podcast and in writing, a bunch of writing that we've been doing and a bunch of speaking at a bunch of conferences that we've been doing, typically when we talk about 4.0, we're talking about it in the context of digital asset management. So we talk about DAM 4.0, but really what we're talking about there is enterprises' journey, as it relates to progressing from content stores as standalone platforms to this concept of content as an intelligent responder to a bunch of signals that we're seeing out in the world in an AI environment. So it's this journey from standalone environments to connected services to content warehouses to, like I said, this DAM 4.0 concept that we describe in detail as this intelligent responder. So very much a content-centric view of the world, but today we're going to be doing something a little bit differently here.
Yeah, so for our MarTech leaders listening out there, we're really going to take that same rubric, but take it to the next level. Or really a better way of saying that is we're going to take it to a wider level with a broader scope. So beyond just DAM, where we have this excellent 1.0 to 4.0 progression, we're going to do it for MarTech as a whole. Both the technology, operations, everything else. So it's a big project, but we think a really useful way of looking at it. So let's get into it.
So let's start with a little bit of a historical perspective and maybe a little baselining, if you will. What's the context and background to this 4-tier framework that we're going to discuss today?
It's really interesting, Jarrod, because there's two kind of parallel timelines here. And while they don't exactly match, they do kind of go together. So on the one hand, there's a timeline of what's happening in the world. In other words, the technology innovation and changing consumer behaviors with growing digitalization and everything else. But then there's a parallel timeline of how enterprise MarTech teams are adapting and evolving. Now, there's 4 tiers to both, but as usual, the enterprise adaptation typically kind of lags what's happening out there in the world.
Right. So this is both kind of a contextual evolution on one hand and an enterprise maturity, or sometimes we like to better describe this as an enterprise MarTech capacity spectrum on the other hand.
Yeah. So if we talk about, the contextual evolution, we kind of define that in terms of eras. And then in terms of the MarTech capacity spectrum, we look at it in terms of like levels and tiers, 1 to 4. So we start out with the website era, which is roughly 1994 to 2009. And we call that MarTech 1.0, was the sort of enterprise response, which was effectively one-way publishing, right? Your website was sort of the center of your digital world and your marketing world. Now, a number of things started happening in the kind of 2007 to 2010 era that really pushed us into the next era, which we say from 2009 to 2025, which is the multi-channel era. So you have the advent of email marketing, social networks, mobile communities, all kinds of profusion of different channels, including voice activation and so forth. And so the enterprise response was really MarTech 2.0, which is multi-channel interaction. Now, that was really where we saw the rise of MarTech, and the whole industry has kind of grown up. It turns out that this has also led to a number of problems and challenges. But from 2009 to 2025, it was roughly the multi-channel era, and our response was MarTech 2.0, which is multi-channel interaction. What's really coming next, we believe, is the post-channel era. And that spans from 2026, in other words, now, to, we're going to say, 2035. That's about as far ahead as we'd like to project. And there's 2 levels of MarTech that go with that. One is what we call MarTech 3.0, which is this kind of omni-channel coherence that we all need to get to. And we've got that roughly from 2026 to 2029. And then the magic really is starting in 2030 is what we call MarTech 4.0 or post-channel engagement. And we really think that's the target, the North Star to try to get to.
Tony, all this talk about eras makes me feel like we should give a shout out to Taylor Swift and on her nuptials, and I'm sure she's listening. But I think when we think about these eras, what's interesting here is these eras are what they are, right? We really don't have a choice here. It's all about what the customer options are going to be, regardless of whether you're a B2B company or a B2C enterprise. It really doesn't matter. So what we can choose, though, at least to some extent, is what structural tier of MarTech that we choose to pursue. And what we've seen, of course, is that enterprise tend to lag. We see some MarTech 1.0 organizations that might be doing okay on the surface, but they're really struggling underneath to deal with, this multi-channel era, let alone what we're talking about here in terms of this post-channel era that you're describing.
Yeah. And so by now, I imagine folks listening in are thinking, post-channel era? What is that? And we'll have a lot to say about that. Fundamentally, what it means is that channels are no longer the organizing construct for how we engage with consumers. They still exist, but they are just one more variable in the grand scheme of all the different contextual variables that you're going to have to entertain to really have an effective customer experience. So we'll get into that a little bit more, but channels still exist, but we are no longer investing in them in the same way, in the same weight, and no longer it's not the primary organizing principle of our stack or our operations anymore. So it's a big deal. And when you stop and look at what MarTech leaders are facing right now, there's really some truly tectonic changes going on. And we know that you all feel this every day, but it's still worth enumerating them to really understand the cumulative impact of what you're under and why this all needs to shift.
Yeah, Tony, there's a lot of forces that our clients are feeling. And so, I think we took some time a while back to start to group these forces into some categories. And so far, we've come up with 3 different types. We have the eternal forces, we have internal forces, and we have external forces. So eternal, internal, and external.
Yeah. First, let's start with the eternal business forces. And these are driving us towards a lot of need to change and to really get away from this channel focus. So you'll recognize all 6 of these. First is intense need to scale. We hear that from all the marketing leaders that we talk to. A need for more efficiency, a lot of pressure there to apply AI for efficiency, which we'll discuss a little bit later. And then speed. Speed is a little bit different than efficiency, but it's really important. Marketers want faster cycle times. The 4th one is precision. We all want to be more precise in the way we're engaging. Effectiveness, which should drive more revenue and retention. And of course, that bugaboo, the great thing in the background is compliance, which is getting more complex. So there's these eternal business forces that are becoming more acute and are particularly making it difficult to do all of that separately in different channels.
So looking at the internal business forces, we have like 4 big ones here. Like you said, channels aren't going away. And if anything, we're seeing new and evolving channels emerge every single day. We're also seeing this force to adhere to some pretty rampant distribution requirements. We think about channels that we own, but we have to be able to cater to other environments that we want our content and data to thrive in. We're creating experiences on other people's channels and environments, and so we need to be able to respond to that in logical ways. We're also being forced as, if we're product people, there is a demand to have more and richer, more meaningful in-product experiences. And so that demand is elevating. And then finally, when we think about channels as we know it, we need to have some sort of cohesion in terms of the customer experience across everything, across those channels that we own, like social and web and whatnot, but also channels like paid and partner channels as well. So thinking about that cohesive customer experience is a huge force that many of us are trying to figure out on a daily basis.
Yeah, and in-product experience is so interesting for marketers. I mean, not just B2B, but B2C now, with the profusion of QR codes and things, and really thinking about lifecycle marketing and that sort of thing in product. It's just a huge issue. And it's driving a lot of organizations to rethink how they do marketing. But so those are the eternal and internal forces. Let's round out with the external business forces. And of course, one is the intense needs of AI. It's funny to be talking about AI as something that needs something. We're kind of being pushed to use it in some cases more than maybe we should. But AI is very needy. If you are going to realize the results of it, the effectiveness from AI, you need to feed a lot into it. And we'll talk about that later. Likewise, agent proliferation, both on the internal and the external side, is going to totally change the way we rethink our channels. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Then the other thing is humans are going to continue and are existing in multiple eras at the same time. You have some humans who are still in the web era. They just want to hit your website and browse themselves. You've got others using agents. You've got others who want to call you on the phone. You've got others, who want to interact with you via text and WhatsApp. And you have to accommodate all those different, modes, whether you like it or not. And then, of course, there's growing scams and enshittification. AI is just making this worse. Really sustaining your wonderful, effective brand is something that remains, really important. You're under a lot of pressure out there, both security and brand integrity as well, which definitely weighs on your AI, bearing. So, yeah, and there's a lot of forces that are driving you to deal with really some fundamental issues here that you can't resolve at a channel level.
Yeah, and what this all adds up to is that you can't serve customers by organizing your operations and technology around that single channel. It just won't scale. It's not fast. It's not efficient. And in worst cases, it can bring some serious compliance issues. And more importantly, it won't meet customer expectations, which is what we're all trying to do. So a channel-centric strategy just isn't effective and is not going to work for the long term.
Yeah, not anymore. And, one of the things that we discuss is we're special mention, because this really gets to the 2030 issue. It may not be a big issue in 26, 27, but it will be by 2030, right in the middle of the post-channel era. And we think one of the dividing lines between MarTech 3.0 and 4.0, and that is customer agents, both on the B2C side and the B2B side.
Yeah, there's been a lot of emphasis on business agents and agentic AI, and we've provided our members here at Real Story Group a lot of guidance and research in that area. A lot of agentic AI for MarTech for now and the foreseeable future is internally focused workflow enhancements. We're seeing a lot of that, but we're beginning to see more customer-facing agents. And by 2030, I think we'll almost certainly see a lot more. But what you're talking about here, Tony, is something a little bit different.
Yeah, so, we'll have enterprise agents like enterprise brand agents, and that will be interacting directly with consumers. We'll have some that are going to be spinning together, channel neutral experiences. All that is good. It adds more value, hopefully, but it's the consumer agent, whether that consumer is a business customer or an authentic B2C consumer. That's what changes this whole game. Because that agent, first of all, is not likely to be channel specific. It's going to be working for an individual. And they're going to want very specific types of value. And so you need to be able to provide that value. They're also going to be an extraordinary filter, filtering out a lot of marketing. And this is going to fundamentally change the way you think, where you'll have to communicate both with a human and their agent. And the agent kind of doesn't care whether it's SMS, email, website. They'll be accessing all of those things. And so you really have to have an approach that speaks to the consumer and their agent outside of a particular channel context. There's a lot more to talk about here. You can imagine the Googles, Apples, Walmarts of this world are already building consumer agents. There will be others as well. A person may have multiple agents. And so you really have to be able to differentiate and still provide brand stories, but also a lot of structured information as well. And to be able to do that really in any interaction context. So once again, the specific channel itself doesn't mean a whole lot to the agent.
So before we leave this topic of the eras of MarTech and the tiers of enterprise MarTech, let's briefly sketch out what this 1 to 4 model looks like. I'll start with 1 and 2, and you can round us out with 3 and 4. So MarTech 1.0, this is squarely in that website era, is really characterized by one-way publishing, right? So traditionally here, we're talking about website as a core customer digital engagement environment, primarily for informational purposes, right? When we're measuring success by traffic paths and volume, everyone knows this story. We certainly would still include custom web applications in this, and you're offering some transactional services, but a lot of these services are generally separate from the marketing team. We see a lot of digital paid media spend managed separately than what we're seeing in this one-way publishing flow. And this publishing flow is really focused a lot on brand awareness. So that's our website era. That's 1.0. 2.0 is a little bit different. In 2.0, we're talking about the multi-channel era, and ultimately we're describing a multi-channel interaction. So here, enterprises have built interaction silos with channel-specific platforms. So think about you're creating experiences on your channels like web, outbound, social, mobile, and your paid media. But not surprisingly, in most MarTech 2.0 organizations, the customer data is largely fragmented across these channels and sometimes very vertically within the enterprise. So that has some repercussions, not surprisingly. So everyone wants to create personalized experiences, and typically where people get in a 2.0 world is you can do some personalization within a channel, but cross-channel personalization is going to be really met with some mixed results, often not so great results. And then we're seeing channel-specific campaigns evolving and become optimized separately with more sophisticated test cycles, and analytics start to improve, but typically they're fragmented, and in order to make any sense of out of what's actually going on here, you need a pretty sophisticated business intelligence team to try to make sense of what's happening across these multiple channels. So that's the 1.0 to 2.0 organization. Tony, take us through what it means to get to a 3.0 and ultimately a 4.0 situation.
Yeah, so I would say that most large enterprises are in transition from 2.0 to 3.0 and in various stages of transition. So what is 3.0? 3.0 is really omni-channel coherence. And so ideally you have some unified customer 360 data layer that's capable of feeding both analytics as well as some sort of activation hub, so that both your insights people and your marketers, whether they're digital or outbound marketing, whatever, can activate that data. That's on the data side, and that's where many organizations have already transitioned, I would say, to MarTech 3.0. Less so on the content side, where you've got core media, narrative, and data assets all managed as a graph, ideally within some sort of content warehouse, either physically a single warehouse or more generally kind of some logical construct. So that's similar to DAM 3.0, really. In MarTech 3.0, the marketers can create richer, much finer segments and tests that can span engagement environments. So you're not just segmenting within channel. You have various flavors of AI and agents that can speed up internal processes and selectively enable more effective customer experiences. Insights AI in particular typically leads the pack there, even though many of you are focused on generative AI. And then marketers similarly transition from campaign orientation, which tends to be channel specific, to more omni-channel journey outcomes. So journeys are different than campaigns. Journeys can subsume campaigns, but typically are of a longer, more omni-channel orientation. And then finally, what MarTech 3.0 is marketing analytics has successfully evolved from kind of channel-based reporting to real journey-based effectiveness, and the marketing and BI teams have been able to then tighten those cycles so you can get more real-time feedback into the loop. So many of you are still working through MarTech 3.0. You have to have 3.0 before you move on. You have to have this kind of foundation in place and have that kind of coherence, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Then the North Star here really is MarTech 4.0, which is true post-channel engagement. Some of you will need to get here sooner, like 2028, 2029. Some of you, for various reasons, may push this beyond 2030. But basically, what's happening here is data about the customer and the environment and the context drives decisioning about the best experience, right? So that data is available everywhere to whatever decisioning needs to happen. Your insights adjust to customer experience in real time. And you're focusing less on this kind of content and data supply chain and more on a demand chain, particularly for content enablement, which means you can respond to human and their agents in the right context in real time. AI enables answers to complex questions that particularly that agents may pose with structured as well as unstructured information. And then you have these continuous real-time, long-running learning loops that are really AI inflected, although there's be humans involved too. We'll talk about that. With agents constantly monitoring compliance. And what happens here is the marketing org and you as a MarTech leader have really transitioned from channel focus to journey responsibilities. And there's a whole lot of things that fall out of that. So that's basically MarTech 1.0 to 4.0 in a nutshell.
All right, let's dig into 4.0. I'm sure everyone is focused on the right side of this of the spectrum because we all want to figure out where we're ultimately headed. And when we've traditionally talked about 4.0 with our clients, it's a bit scary in some ways and exciting in other ways, but it's complex because there's really several dimensions to it, right? I mean, we're talking about new technologies, new architectures, new vendors potentially. There's decisioning around, do I need to build this or buy it? There's new roles, there's new business case or an evolving business case that needs to be made here. There's new org structures that need to be put in place to even handle this or even potentially handle where we're going. And then there's this new concept of what does even MarTech leadership mean? What does it look like?
Yeah, so there's a lot going on here, a lot of questions. And the happy news we have for you, dear listener, is that we have good answers to those questions. And we've put them together in a book that will be released later this summer. It's called MarTech 2030. And what the book covers is, again, this kind of historical tour, but more critically, what do you need to do to get to MarTech 3.0 to 4.0? Looking at the overall architectures, the customer experience, what you need to do with respect to data, content, and decisioning. How does the org models change? What's the new business case? What does leadership mean? So we'll talk about later how you can get your hands on that book. But what we'll try to do first is really start with this, what we call the North Star. So what does MarTech 4.0 actually look like in more practical terms?
All right. Well, that's exciting news, and I know you've been working hard on this book, and I'm sure we've already given some of our clients a bit of a preview, to see what they think, and everyone's come back with really great feedback. So I among so many others, can't wait to see it hit the streets. As we dig into details here about 4.0, Tony, let's start as we always do with architecture. As you move up the spectrum with each passing era, architecture continues to grow in importance. We know now that suitable architecture is perhaps the best predictor of how successful you'll even be with AI.
Yeah, with AI and customer experience more generally. So I'll try to sketch it out really briefly here. Like there are some, evergreen concepts and issues and structures that are off to the side of your stack. And so that has to do with governance, operations, insights, compliance. Those are going to remain. You will still need real live marketers, although the nature of those marketers is going to change. We'll talk about that. And then we think that agents and agentic AI is going to be pervasive and is going to play a critical role in terms of gluing a lot of this together. But any stack still has to start with a customer. And I think that one of the defining things is going to be the interaction mode. Like, are you interacting with, one of three kind of contexts? One is directly human, like there's a human-directed interaction. The second is customer agent intermediary. So you're dealing with an agent that they have a wide variety of a wide spectrum of control. And the third one that you mentioned, Jarrod, is an externally intermediated interaction. So we'll see more and more walled gardens. Like Meta, X, and others. And those are going to be, whether we like it or not, they're out there. And that's where a lot of the interaction is going to happen. You'll still have these engagement channels, like we call them engagement environments now because it's just an environmental variable, like contact centers, in-store channels and influencers, e-commerce, sites and apps. Those will still exist, but they're not going to be as important. What's really important here are the customer foundation services. So we divide those really into three kind of pillars. The first is data, which is your customer data ecosystem. And we call this the system of truth, or really the best truth as you know it. And that's where you'll apply Insights AI. The second pillar is content, and we call this system of meaning. So content is less about truth and more about meaning, and who are you and what are you about and what are the advantages of your products and services. And that will be supported by generative AI. And then decisions are really system of direction, right? Like how are we going to personalize? How are we going to provide the best experiences? So on and so forth. And that's where decisioning AI will come in. So in some ways, it's actually a simplified stack. Although we'll get to later, there's a little bit more to it than that.
So if there's one big takeaway here, it's that starting with MarTech 3.0 and definitely in MarTech 4.0, customer foundation services is where the game is mostly going to be won and lost, right? Today we're competing in the channels. Tomorrow we'll be competing from our core. Now, it doesn't mean that UX and UI don't matter, but the way we'll assemble experiences in the future is going to be very different here. And again, probably not mediated as heavily by your content management system or your commerce platform or whatever you have at the engagement tier. It's really going to be fundamental core services that are going to determine who wins and loses. Meanwhile, Tony, you mentioned AI, and in fact, 4 different types of AI. We've discussed this in the previous episodes quite a bit, but let's think about AI and how it looks in a MarTech 4.0 world.
Yeah, there's a lot to say here. I mean, clearly AI is going to be part of the fabric of everything. That doesn't mean that you should light up all of the AI that comes in your vendor tools. In fact, in our last episode, we discouraged you from doing that. I think the most important takeaway is to own the decision loop, right? And the decision loop really starts with Insights AI that uncovers opportunities, provides data and analysis that then leads to decisioning AI, where you direct how you're going to engage with the customer. And then that's a directive for engagement that then may invoke generative AI to create the relative experiences. The customer has those experiences. You use machine learning to continuously then learn from that and pump that back into Insights AI and go forward. The value is really in the loop. And you definitely want to own that loop. You don't want the vendors to own it. You don't want your systems integrator to own it. You definitely don't want your agencies to own that loop. We talked about that as well in a previous podcast. You really, in a MarTech 4.0 world, you own the loop and the value comes in the learning and the optimization.
All right, so AI is a loop, and it's certainly not a feature. But earlier you mentioned humans. Where are they in this?
Yeah, so humans are pervasive in this new AI MarTech 4.0 world, and that really I think bursts a kind of a myth that you're going to need fewer humans. In fact, you may need the same number of humans, potentially in different roles. We'll talk about that, but when we're talking about this loop, you need a human before the loop to help define everything and make sure the inputs are right. You often need humans in the loop to actually make decisions. You need humans on the loop to monitor what's going on, and you need humans after the loop to interpret what's happened. So there's definitely really critical roles for humans here, and I think we need to dispense with this myth that somehow AI is going to bring us a bunch of staff cuts.
Right. It's not about whether or not we need humans, but the roles of humans are going to be different. We have to acknowledge that.
The overall sense of this is that humans in the MarTech 4.0 model relative to a MarTech 2.0 model, which is more manual, they're going to shift from producers to managers. And so these are higher order tasks that are going to focus on judgment and creativity, overseeing systems, drive strategy and output. So, in a MarTech 2.0 model, you might spend 10% of your effort on strategy, 15% on experience design, 20% on production, 25% on reporting and insights, and then 30% on in-channel execution, right? In a MarTech 4.0 model, you're spending probably 30% of your time on policy design, 25% on constraints and input testing and simulation, another 20% on algorithmic audiencing, auditing, 15% on a learning loop, 10% on production tweaks. So I'm presenting these numbers not necessarily to be explicit, but to say, look, the actual work that's going on here dramatically changed.
Yeah, and that's a good summary about the activity and capabilities that are needed and really necessary when thinking about org design, right? You have to start there. But I'm curious if we can talk a little bit more about some of the specific roles that will be needed in a 3.0 world.
Yeah, so let's talk about 3.0 right now, because that's what a lot of our conversations with our members, our corporate members, is about. Okay, I love 4.0. We've created this North Star. What do I do in a MarTech 3.0 world? And so I think there's at least 6 roles to start thinking about staffing. And one that many forward-thinking roles already have is a marketing data ops person. So this is a data ops person who's working within marketing, who's dealing with activation, right, of data, consent, definitions, all that. You need graph managers to support ontologies, taxonomies, and everything else that we know is really critical in a damn 4.0 world, damn 3.0 world, really. Journey overseers, experience orchestrators, agent controllers, algorithm audit leads. These are 6 of the 12 roles we identify in the book, but they're the 6 that are most likely to come up sooner rather than later. So in terms of career resilience, it really comes from systems judgment, data fluency, the ability to work within governance frameworks and with your peers, because, none of these are channel specific roles. Above all this, of course, just to add, is the evolution of MarTech leadership, right? There's a whole multi-chapter segment on that in the book. For today, I think maybe, we can just summarize what are some of the main themes.
Yeah, I think the Uber theme that I get out of all this, Tony, is that, the MarTech leader of the future is moving from platform steward, as they've been traditionally tasked, and to this enterprise customer engagement leader, right? They're thinking about the customer in a much more meaningful way. So their role is not about owning the stack. It's about translating it across the enterprise, whether that's marketing strategy to customer experience, to legal and compliance, to data and AI services, to those technology platforms. You're the translator, you're the integrator, you're the operator, kind of playing a really important role for the enterprise as a whole, with the goal of creating the best experience for the customer.
Yeah. And there's a lot of leadership with your peers involved there. So we mentioned MarTech 3.0, and let's discuss that some more, because it's a practical lens. What can I do today? And that's definitely an area where Real Story Group can help you. And we'll get into that next, but first, a word from our sponsor.
Dear listeners, did you know that 16 of the Fortune 20 enterprises have turned to Real Story Group over the years for MarTech advice, either to guide them through an important technology selection or to help them steer their stack in the right direction?
That's right, Jarrod. But our Real Story Group corporate members come in many sizes, including some really digitally focused mid-sized firms. The key thing all these clients share is a desire to take their MarTech stack and their professional careers to the next level. To explore further, find us at realstorygroup.com.
Okay, Tony, so everyone listening out there is asking themselves, I get it. You're painting the real story about the world in 2030, give or take a few years, of course, and that's good. But what do I need to do to succeed?
Yeah, so we would argue start with 3.0. Like there's not this magical jump that I can go from 2.0 to 4.0. It's totally unrealistic. You have to really build a 3.0 base before you can go to 4.0. And I would say, again, the slight majority of our corporate members are already doing this, at least to some extent, maybe differently at different levels of emphasis across different parts of their stack. But, the key concept that you mentioned, Jarrod, is building your core. Now, this is not sufficient to getting to 4.0, but it is necessary, right? So we're making a distinction between sufficiency and necessity here. And you have to be able to build out your core, which is your shared foundation services around data, content and decisioning, and then some enterprise operations, governance, workflow, insights, the AI or learning loop that I mentioned, and beginning to look at agentic AI as an integration mode. And so the reason for this is that if you have those 3 pillars of data, which is your best truth, content, your system of meaning, and decisioning, your system of interaction, if those live inside of channel tools, your customer experience and your AI is all happening within silos, and the enterprise totally loses leverage, and you totally lose scalability here.
And one of my favorite kind of corollaries here is that as companies get stronger at their core, they should also get lighter at the edge. And when I talk about edge, I'm talking about those systems that are closest to the people that you're trying to reach, right? So traditionally, it's those web CMS tools, those email service provider tools, marketing automation platforms, the social tools, the ad platforms, the loyalty tools, or even your analytics measuring tools. I think what we've seen happen is this heavy edge kind of developed, right? There's a heaviness to those systems that were closest to our consumers and clients and prospects. And what happens when things get heavy on these edge kind of platforms? All these different tools, while seemingly disparate, they're repeating some of the same foundational work over and over and over again. So you contrast this with this future model where you have this strong core, you're able to actually get lighter at this interaction tier. And so maybe you don't need to spend the millions and millions of dollars on your CMS or your ESP or your marketing automation platform or your social tools. I'm sure there's going to be still a spend there, but maybe it's not as much because you're not repeating the same foundational data work, the same foundational content work, the same foundational decisioning work. That stuff is baked into your core that you're relying on, regardless of the tier platform that you're using to create those experiences. So it's a nice consequence of this transition.
Yeah, and as an aside, though, this has totally changed the way that we at Real Story Group do technology selection. So technology selections has always been a core competency of ours. You and I wrote a book about it. Still, that book still has, I think, the appropriate strategy and tactics. But now it's an interesting question about whether and how you should replace something that's at the edge. In some cases, we're recommending people to defer that decision. There's definitely a new set of constraints and opportunities. But one thing you shouldn't do is double down and increase your investment at the edge. That is the multi-channel answer. That's a MarTech 2.0 answer for the wrong era. And you have to be very careful because vendors like Adobe and Salesforce and Oracle, SAP and others are really pushing you in that direction. And I think what this is shifting for us is our much beloved MarTech Stack vendor map, which we do as a subway map. We've been doing it now for 18 years. You can find it at realstorygroup.com/vendor map. And, we show all the different marketplaces, all the different marketing technology marketplaces as subway lines, and they intersect at different vendor stations. And it's a good way of visualizing the market. But I think what you have as a CMS and what you have as an email provider and what you have as a social marketing platform is going to matter less and less over time. And that's where the funds are going to come from, is by lightening that level and then transitioning those funds and people and resources lower in your stack.
Okay, let's close out where we began, and that's architecture. We've been making the case that architecture is really determinative to your potential success. But what is a transitional 3.0 architecture actually going to look like?
Yes, let's have a look. Again, I don't want to displace other considerations like org structure, role change, evolving business case. But if you look at the MarTech 3.0 stack division of labor, there's really two lenses. One is the stack and the other is build versus buy. So, at the bottom level, you've got the context layer, which is semantics, policy, governance, the foundation services we talked about, identity, customer data. Then you've got AI services above that, insights AI, decisioning, Gen AI. You have an orchestration layer above that, which coordinates the treatment and the planning and assembles the interfaces. And then you're executing by providing customer experiences to humans still today, increasingly agents in your different channels. So what's interesting about this is that the foundation services like identity and customer data and so forth is mostly a buy story. The context layer today is probably mostly a build story. When you talk about AI services, there's some buy and some build. The orchestration layer above that is mostly build today. The local execution layer has been and still mostly remains mostly a buy story. So it's interesting, the different sorts of investments that we're seeing enterprises having to make to build this 3.0 stack.
So you just introduced some really key concept there, like context layer and orchestration layer and some of the components that make those up. And I think it's important just to remind our listeners and viewers that our last episode was on personalization and AI. And in that episode, we went into pretty significant detail about those particular topics. So if that's of interest to you, go back and check that one out. But in the meantime, I think one of the main takeaways here is that the introduction of AI is really bringing back a bit more build over buy. And this represents a pretty significant shift, no?
Yeah, at least for now. We have new research that just came out about AI vendors that focus on marketing, and they're beginning to catch up with business cases that are emerging. And so they're beginning to be a little bit more robust in terms of moving from features to actually supplying particular business scenarios. But when you look at the loop, when you look at the full end-to-end automation and not just these kind of show pony AI pilots, what you're doing is integrating agents. You're combining different types of AI. You're owning the context layer. You got to own the orchestration layer. There's a lot of glue work. And this is requiring some build services. So the good news is I think the advent of all this means you can reduce your agency and your AI and to some extent your software spend elsewhere to be able to provide the resources for this.
Right. So that takes us back to the business case for MarTech 4.0. There's definitely a business case for it. And you have a chapter on that in your book. And like everything else, it's going to be different. It's going to the 4.0 business case is going to be a very different business case than the MarTech 2.0 business case. But I think we're going to have to save that for a different podcast episode.
Yeah, that's right. So of course, folks, you'll want to subscribe so you don't miss that one.
So one final takeaway, amidst a whole bunch of other takeaways, hopefully, is how the evolution of technology and consumer behavior is inevitable. But the path that your enterprise takes to get there, that's going to vary on a number of different factors. So the book that you have coming out, Tony, talks about creating your own North Star. And that might be for 2029 or 2031 or even 2030, but it's a target endpoint.
That's right. And you don't have to get there alone. Real Story Group and other corporate members that you can interact with, can help you figure out what that endpoint looks like and then how to get there.
So in addition to our advisory services that we offer, the listeners are going to have a book to kind of help them serve as this guide. So help us understand, when is the book going to be ready and how can someone get it?
Yeah, it looks like it's going to be available mid to late August. So all you have to do is go to realstorygroup.com/2030, and you can sign up to be notified as soon as it's available, both in hardcover and electronic ebook format.
Fantastic. We can't wait. And for everyone who is listening or watching today, if you liked what you heard today, we really would appreciate it if you would share with a colleague, with a friend, with a peer, to help spread the word about the real story on MarTech. And as always, we welcome your feedback in terms of likes, comments, emails, LinkedIn posts, telling us what you think is coming next, and tell us where you are on your journey to MarTech 4.0. We're always interested to hear that as well. Tony, thank you for taking some time. Let's get this book out the door. And as always, thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time on The Real Story on MarTech.
See you next time.